Probably one of my favorite quotes of all time is a quote from Voltaire. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it, which is a great lead in to freedom of speech, press, assembly, and petition. Uh, Notice that one thing you are not free from in the United States is you are not free from being offended. So if somebody's speech or their assembly irritates you, doesn't matter. They have the right to do it. Okay. Free speech. The struggle is real. Um, so, question that the courts often wrestle with is the question of whether freedom of expression is absolute. So, does no law in the First Amendment really mean no law should actually inhibit your freedom of expression? Again, it's a balancing act. Your freedom to exercise your speech and to exercise your assembly is protected until it conflicts with other rights. So, you, yes, have freedom of speech, but like I said in the introduction of the Bill of Rights notes, if you are upset about income inequality and your freedom of expression is going to burn down a bunch of mansions of rich people, that's not okay. You cannot express your disdain for income inequality by taking away somebody's own natural rights, like the right to life, liberty, and property. So there is a balance of freedom of expression with other people's rights and the public good. Now, this is especially true in instances dealing with national security. So you do not have like freedom of press or freedom of expression if it's going to hinder like our troops, put our troops in danger. If you want to report on, troop movements in Syria or, a SEAL Team 6 operation against Boko Haram in Nigeria, you don't have that option. That isn't something that you have freedom of expression. All right, there's different types of speech. There's pure speech. Pure speech is the most protected form of speech. Pure speech is written. Not written, excuse me, spoken. And it's really hard to like crack down on somebody for the words that they speak. Again, going back to the Voltaire quote, just because I don't like what you said doesn't mean that I could stop you from saying it. Symbolic speech is a little bit more tricky. Symbolic speech are actions that are meant to send a message. So a lot of this you see in protest, like signs, when people are picketing, some of the signs that people have, they may be offensive. But classically, you're looking at Texas versus Johnson. Texas versus Johnson, a Supreme Court case where Johnson was burning a flag in front of the uh, Republican National Convention in Dallas, and he was burning a flag to protest Reagan's nomination. Um, and he was arrested because he was burning the flag, and the Supreme Court said, look, we may not like that he was doing this to the American flag and what that symbolizes, but it doesn't mean that we can't stop him from doing it. So the doctrine of symbolic speech is not precise. Burning a flag is protected speech. Just because you don't like it doesn't mean that he can't do it. All right, prior restraint. Prior restraint is pretty much what you would call censorship. Prior restraint is when the government actions prevent material from being published or censored. I really don't have time in the videos, just because the videos are limited to 15 minutes, to read and explain these comics to you, but they're pretty straightforward. So what I would really suggest to you is this is a comic regarding Near versus Minnesota, which was in 1931. I'll give you the gist of the decision. The government should sometimes limit individuals' behavior on the grounds of national security. So, government censorship is allowed if what you are saying is going to put our nation at risk. So I would highly recommend that you pause this, read that comic, so you get an understanding of why Near versus Minnesota came to court in the first place, and you can fully understand why the Supreme Court would limit that person's freedom of speech on the grounds of national security. Same thing with Texas versus Johnson. On the next slide, this explains the whole court case as Texas versus Johnson. All right, speech and public order. War is basically going to be the scenario where the government can justify limiting speech the most. So censorship is going to be in a fuller effect in times of crisis. One example of that is Schenck versus the United States in 1919. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes declared that the government can limit speech if it provokes clear and present danger. Now, that's a huge doctrine. That's something big that you need to know. It shows up on the AP exam. So Schenck versus the United States establishes limited speech in instances of clear and present danger. Now, the way that I've always remembered this case is Schenck, when you hear like that noise, shank, 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 in a horror movie, you know you are clearly in danger. So, shank, shank, shank versus the United States. Clear and present danger. Okay, again, what I'll explain Schenck versus the United States because it is an important case for you to know. So what Schenck was doing is he was passing out literature encouraging people to dodge the draft in World War I and saying the resistance of the draft is an American right and duty. You guys are like convicts. Okay, so he was encouraging people to burn their draft cards. He was arrested under the Espionage Act of 1917, and he was asking about, what about my freedom of speech? And the Supreme Court said Schenck's arrest violated his First Amendment right to free speech. That right is one of the most important in the Bill of Rights. Okay, so that's what his lawyer says. And then the lawyer, probably a solicitor general, said the right to freedom of speech is not absolute. Schenck created a threat to our nation's security. And they agreed that if what you are saying is going to put somebody in danger, then you cannot say it. It's in this decision, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote about it's the same thing as that you can't be allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater because it's going to put people in danger. People are going to panic. They're going to trample over each other. And that shouldn't be a protected speech. So your speech is protected up to the point where you're hurting other people. All right, the Smith Act of 1940 forbade the advocacy of violent overthrowing of the American government. Okay. So free speech advocates did little to stem the relentless prosecution known as McCarthyism during the Cold War of the 1950s. When Senator Joseph McCarthy's accusations that he couldn't prove that public officials were communists, it created an atmosphere in which broad restrictions were placed on freedom of expression. So the thing about this Smith Act is because of like McCarthyism and because of, people, the government kind of restricting people's right to protest a government by passing out leaflets or gathering signatures on petitions and stuff like that, the Supreme Court has restricted the government's ability to shut down protests and petitions. The Supreme Court protects that right to petition your government if you're angry with your government, or to protest your government if you're angry with your government. Whereas you can't really do you can't talk about a violent overthrow of government. You can do the things like not my president's protest. That is totally protected speech. Because again, as long as you're not putting people in immediate risk or danger, you should be able to speak out against your government. All right, free press issues. Just a couple of things dealing with the press. Now, we've already done media, so this is kind of a review right here. The free press and being able to have the media critique the job of the government and what our government officials are doing is imperative to a healthy democracy, a liberal democracy. So you have to allow for a free press so the reporters can be watchdogs and protect the public from a corrupt government. Press and trials. It's important that the press should be able to cover court proceedings. Part of having a public trial is for the press to be there and be able to monitor the government's actions. Impartial juries, though, you have to watch pre-trial coverage. And you also want to make sure that any of your potential jurors aren't exposed to too much information so they can make unbiased decisions about their rulings. And really, the last thing I want to cover about free press issues at this point is that reporters are protected by shield laws. Reporters, if they are asked to reveal their sources, their confidential sources, they should not go to jail if they refuse to reveal their sources as part of like obstruction of justice. If they reveal their sources, then nobody's going to want to talk to them and they can't do their job. So they are protected from having to divulge too much information in a court of law.